Hello, and welcome to the Megan Taylor Creative Podcast, a show for entrepreneurs looking to grow their business with digital marketing. In this episode, I'll be giving you my foolproof guide on how you can easily repurpose content. Let's get started. In this episode of the Megan Taylor Creative Podcast, I wanted to talk about content repurposing because I've noticed that it's a very big topic online, and I think that some people aren't sure how to go about it in the right way. Some people have maybe tried and tested it, but not really seen very good results with it because they're not using their content to the fullest or creating content that gives them enough value. And I think the key theme that I want you all to take away from this is that content repurposing isn't just about creating a piece of content and then cutting it in a way where you can distribute it to other channels, although that is a part of it. It's about ensuring that you create a wider scope of content that you can then realize the value of and make sure that each time you create an iteration of it, it provides the same kind of value that the original piece of content did. This is going to be quite an in-depth episode. I think there's a lot to cover. So as always, let's just get straight into it. The first thing that we need to do before we can actually get on to thinking about how to create content and repurpose it efficiently and content repurposing workflows and all of that, we need to actually establish what content repurposing is. Simply put, content repurposing is the practice of taking one piece of content and repurposing that piece of content into something else. But you need to make sure that that piece of content that you created from the piece of content still has value. And again, the key word here is absolutely value. I think that without creating a piece of content that offers value and is packed with lots of, actionable tips and information that your audience wants and meets the search intent and all of those wonderful things, depending on what content you're creating, will be different. But you need to ensure that it's actually interesting and can be broken down into smaller pieces of content. And content repurposing is important because it saves you from having to reinvent the wheel every time that you want to create content. So for example, with my podcast, I like to use it as the key theme for Instagram each week. I may occasionally break away from that mold, but it just means that I know I have a sense of direction. So last week it was more about starting a business, what it's been like running a business. This week I'm going to change the direction of my Instagram channel to focus more on content repurposing. And now that we've established what content repurposing is and why it's important, let's actually take a look at what my content repurposing workflow looks like. Before we kind of get into the actual tips and tricks that I've picked up, I want to talk about two things. And the first thing is that before I actually think about content repurposing, I think about my content strategy as a whole and how I can create content that I know I will be able to use time and time again. I like to have a big overarching piece of content each week, whether that be through the blog posts or through my podcast. And then through that, I can, take quotes from the blog posts and create captions on Instagram, or I can use a lot of the content from the blog and the podcast and turn them into Twitter threads. So the first thing to do then with this in mind is to actually think about what long form content can you actually create each week or each month that you're going to be able to sit down and provide the best value for your target audience, and then focus on actually bringing that piece of content into life and making sure that it's the best that it can be. Again, you don't want to have a watered down piece of content that you think is good but actually lacks value or substance or isn't as engaging as you think it might be. We've all been there. We've all created pieces of content that we were initially really happy with, and then as we kind of go into the editing phase, we've discovered that actually it didn't have the same quality that we would expect from ourselves. So therefore we have to go go and create it again. But if you think about value from the beginning, the chances of you having to make more edits or completely change the structure of a certain piece of content that you're wanting to create, then that's going to save you a lot of time in the long run. And the sort of long form pieces that work really well for content repurposing include blog posts, like I said. My podcast is really good. If you have a YouTube channel, you could use your videos and repurpose them for shorter vertical video content that's obviously very popular right now. You could even do an ebook and then turn that into different chapters. I've done that with some of my clients and past businesses that I've worked for before, and that's been really effective. It just means that you have blog content each week and you don't have to do much to turn that chapter of the book, for example, into an interesting blog post. You obviously have to add a few things to make sure that it reads well as a blog, but generally the content is there. And I think, don't think about content repurposing from the beginning. Think about what the maximum value you can provide to someone is, and then take that and then make a long form piece of content. And the other part of this is actually thinking about how you're going to document this process. And that's where the workflow comes in. I personally use Notion to document and record all of my content strategies. I've actually created a new content strategy template, which I'm very excited about, and I'm just adding a few elements to make sure that it's user friendly and anyone can pick it up and take it and integrate it into their content strategy and their content ideation workflows. And with that content strategy, you need to think about the calendar, so when you're going to need content, and you also need to think about having a standard. So this is where templates come in. And if you're, say, taking a big piece of long form content, whether it's a video or a audio from a podcast, if you have a podcast, then you can go into your content calendar and think about, okay, what are the themes of those long form pieces of content? What are the standout sections of those pieces of content, and write that down. And when you're doing that, think about the different formats that you'll need for certain distribution channels. And then through that, you can start creating a content calendar and corresponding templates that you can use when you actually sit down to create the content. And I think it's really important to think about, when you're creating content that you know has been derived from a long form piece of content, you need to think about that piece of content as its own piece of content. And I think this is where a lot of people fail in content repurposing. So for example, a big no-no in the social media management world is taking TikToks, if you have a TikTok account, and uploading it to Reels with the TikTok mark. And Instagram have actually started to kind of crack down on repurposed TikToks in general. I think not just in terms of the algorithm making note of that and then not putting the content out as much, but in terms of how Instagram users react to that content. The cultures on Instagram and TikTok are very different, and trending audios, for example, that might work well, or formats that might work well on Instagram Reels, are actually going to be different to the formats and the trending audios and just the general culture of TikTok in general. TikTok is obviously the highest performing vertical video content platform, and I think it will always be that way because it was one of the first. And I think that it's very obvious for a lot of Instagram users that Reels is a direct competitor of that, and Instagram has specifically started pushing Reels so that their platform can still compete with TikTok. So just bear that in mind. And it's the same with not just video content, but text-based content as well. You want to make sure that if you're taking a piece of text from a blog post and then you're repurposing that as part of your caption or as a infographic, an educational infographic on Instagram or whatever social media platform you'd like to use, you need to make sure that you're thinking about your audience over there. So every time I take a bit of a blog post, for example, I won't just take that exact bit and use that as my caption. I will think about Instagram and how I know audiences react to certain types of captions, and then I will slowly mold that piece of, I say slowly, I will quickly mold that piece into a caption that I know will actually get the engagement and reaction that I want from my Instagram followers. Because your audience on each distribution channel, they might be different. They're probably going to be the same in some way, but they will have nuances, and each distribution channel will have certain things that make it tick. So you need to remember that. And that's really my main workflow. It's a really simple flow that helps me to identify what pieces of content I can actually take and repurpose, and whether I need to create a new piece of content. And the thing is, sometimes you might just need to make a new piece of content. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that if you have a framework to help you get there. And you're always thinking about value and how you can maximize the value of a piece of content you're working on, then it's not going to be a waste of time. It's when you start to think about a piece of content, but you think about it as, okay, how can I use it for each distribution channel? That's the wrong approach. You really need to think about the content and what it's going to do for your audience, and how helpful it's going to be, and how attractive it's going to make your business look. And obviously, you make your business look attractive by providing the information that your audience wants. Okay, so we've established a workflow that you can take and you can use each time you sit down to create a piece of content. You know to think about the value. You then know to think about templates and how you can start to morph your overarching piece of long form content into smaller bite-sized pieces of content that still pack a lot of value. So let's actually take a look at the sort of tools that I use to do this. And I think this is going to be a large chunk of this episode because there's a lot of different tools that I use. So the first tool that I use is Canva, and you probably know Canva. I think every social media manager that exists has Canva because A, it's very affordable, B, it's very powerful, and C, it's very smart. And the reason why it's very smart for content repurposing is that it allows you to resize your graphics. So for example, if you create an Instagram graphic, you can then resize it to be a Pinterest graphic in just the hit of a button. And obviously you will have to make sure that the graphic still looks good. This isn't going to automatically morph each element that you have on your graphic and make sure that it fits within the aspect ratio or the dimensions of the graphic. You have to do that work. But generally, it just means that you don't even have to think about dimensions or anything like that. You can just think, okay, this graphic is great for Instagram. Let's just resize it and make it into a Pinterest graphic too. Canva also has video capabilities. I find that the video editing software that they have is very, very basic, and it's almost kind of like the Paint of video editing software. If you ever used Windows Paint at school or anything like that, that's what the video editing software reminds me of. It's very watered down, and to be honest, it's a little bit clunky. And if you've used other video software before, say for example, I'm quite familiar with Adobe Premiere, which is a much more powerful and advanced piece of video editing software, then Canva's capabilities might seem a bit too basic for you. But if you're literally just using it to make very quick reels, then it might be worth it to you to just stick with that rather than having to look into a different piece of software. Speaking of other pieces of software, the main piece of software that I use for content repurposing other than Canva is actually Descript. And Descript is great because it's actually the piece of software I use to record my podcast. So I'm using it right now. I'm speaking into it. I can actually see the different audio and sound waves as I'm speaking into the microphone. And then what I can do is I can take the audio that I've recorded into Descript and I can transcribe it. So I can create a transcribe of each clip, and then I can actually create a new project, duplicate that project, and then create a reel with that project. And you can also add captions, which is something that I need to start doing, and then add your video clip if you have one as a different track that you can layer on top of your audio, and then you're good to go. That's a reel. So I think Descript is really well priced. I think it's under £15, and I've been using it for a few months now, and I wouldn't turn back. I can do so much with it, and if I ever wanted to create video content with my face on it, which I still want to do at some point, then I would already have a software to be able to do that. I could even record it directly from my laptop. So just to kind of give you an indication of the power of Descript, I highly recommend that if you're looking into specifically video content. And the other piece of software that I use to generally create and congregate all my ideas is Notion. And I've already talked about Notion in this podcast, but I really love Notion. I think that it is essentially a second brain. It allows you to kind of splurge all your ideas out in one central place, and you can break it down into different categories, different pages, but everything is unified. And I think that's the most important thing for me. I can now see how all of my thoughts actually amalgamate into one vision, which is very important when you're planning for your business, when you're planning content for your business. You don't want your ideas to be scattered. You want to be able to see what you've actually already come up with. And then if you have any other ideas, whether they can just sit in the back burner in like an idea bank, which I have, or they can actually start to go into your content calendar. I can see what ideas I've already got in my content calendar, what content I want to make, and then whether I've got an idea that I think will fit into that big campaign, then I can go in. And I can also keep all my assets there, which is again great for content repurposing, which is the main theme of the video. I can put my podcast clips in there. I can put Instagram graphics in there that I created from podcasts. I can write my blog posts in there and then start writing Twitter threads through that blog post. So I can break it down very easily and I can see the campaigns as a whole, which is really important when you're doing cross-channel campaigns and cross-channel marketing in general, which is generally why you would want to do content repurposing in the first place, because obviously you don't necessarily want to have to create a new piece of content each time you're planning a campaign. You don't want to have to do that. That's going to take a lot of time. But if you can see, okay, this is the long form piece of content and how it's actually going to look potentially across the calendar and what the assets will look like, then Notion is a very powerful tool for that. So yeah, that's it. That's everything for this episode. I really enjoyed recording this episode because content repurposing is something that I am very passionate about and it's very on trend. And I think that it's a trend that's here to stay. And I think if you leverage it well, then it can really serve you in your content creation efforts. If you do want to work with me to repurpose any content, so for example, if you have a podcast and you want me to take your podcast and make it into a blog post, then I'd be happy to do that. We do offer those services as a full service content marketing agency. Just a quick note, the Megan Taylor Creative website is currently down for maintenance right now, but I still have the contact form and the blog up whilst I'm just rejigging things, and I'm essentially changing the entire infrastructure of how the behind the scenes marketing and sales works, which is why I've just decided to take it down, and it will probably be down for a couple of weeks. I'm going away next Saturday, which is mad to say, hopefully, fingers crossed. I'm going to America, to Miami, and I just know that with my workload and looking at what I've got planned for the next couple of weeks, that is just not going to get done or completed until after I come back. So the temporary solution is to just take it down and then have a contact page. I also wanted to mention that I have revamped my email list and it's now the Creative Content Digest, and that will be a weekly newsletter, but there might be some bonus emails thrown in there every so often. So if you like the podcast and want some more content about content marketing, then you can obviously subscribe to that and you can still do that on the homepage. I will be making a specific landing page for that at some point, so that is very clear to people how to sign up whilst the website is still down. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please follow us on Spotify if that's where you're listening, or subscribe to us on YouTube so that you'll be notified every time we come up with a new episode. I'm really trying to build up the confidence to actually start showing myself on camera and starting to create more longer form video content, but I really need to think about how I'm going to do that. So yeah, look out for that, and I'm sure that's something that I will talk about in the newsletter as well. And as always, I will speak to you next week. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.